Imagine if over 1 million people decided they wanted to move to New York City. That's actually what our city planners think is likely to happen over the next 10 to 15 years. Indeed, we're already in the midst of a population boom that has added over 125,000 newcomers in just the last few years. How will we cope with this influx of people? How will we find enough housing, jobs, subway cars, schools, parks, even electricity to accommodate our new neighbors? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is Richard Ravitch, a partner at Ravitch Rice and Co, and a longtime civic leader of New York City, including a stint he served as the chairman of the MTA. Dick, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Nice to be here.
What would you say, from your position looking out over the city, is the biggest problem that the city faces from an economic standpoint?
How to capture the population growth that is inevitable as a result of the demographic changes that are taking place in the United States, and as a result of the fact that New York City is such a magnet that it's attracting young people from all over the place.
Isn't that sort of a pleasant change, though? I mean, we were losing population for so long.
It certainly is. It's terrific.
But what are the implications for when you look out? What particularly concerns you? What areas?
Transportation and housing.
Are the two biggies?
Yes.
And from a transportation perspective, are there things that you think we should be doing that we aren't?
Yes, there are many things we should be doing that we're not, and I think in some cases our priorities are misplaced and that we're planning to spend money on things which will not really facilitate the kind of growth and sound planning, instead of putting our money, limited as it is in quantity, into the places which will be helpful.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. I think, for example, constructing the 7-line extension to the west side of Manhattan, which is to be paid for out of the city's budget, is not a sensible use. In a world of unlimited resources, it would be a great thing to do. But that part of the city is going to be developed anyway. It can just track the way land prices have gone up over there to recognize it's going to happen anyway. But for example, to open up the East Bronx by extending by building the Second Avenue subway, not just in Manhattan, but extending it up to the East Bronx and down to the Lower East Side, will open up vast areas of the city for development. And one of the reasons we have a housing problem is we don't have enough of it. And therefore the law of supply and demand has created an enormous crunch on prices. We need to build a lot more. And
do you see the transportation and the housing issues as interlinked then?
They always are to some extent. There has to be a public infrastructure, by which I mean transportation, education, parks.
The East Bronx is the area that you would target?
It's one of them, sure. Plus there are other areas in Queens and Staten Island and Brooklyn.
Now, this is something that you think is sort of obvious, yet obviously our policymakers are making different decisions. What do you think the issue is there?
I'm not sure that they're making different decisions. I think they're very project-oriented and tend to focus on a few specific projects as sort of the end game in the process, rather than sitting back and saying, hey, where's the long-term growth going to be, and how are we going to invest our capital funds, and how do we increase the availability of capital funds to invest in this infrastructure? I mean, what's really interesting is two things, and that is that the public infrastructure in this city, as in any other city in this country, was essentially funded out of the real estate tax revenues that a municipality derived. And most of this infrastructure was built during a period, the first 75 years of the last century, or the first 50 years to be precise, was financed out of the real estate revenues, which were growing, tax revenues, because the population was expanding. So we were able to cover the interest cost and amortize the investment. And then two things happened. One, that infrastructure got tired and weary and required replacement at a rate that the political system wasn't willing to address. That was the condition of the subway system in the 60s and 70s. Because spending money on the maintenance or repair of public infrastructure is not a politically sexy thing for people to do. At the same time, our access to the capital markets, the ability to borrow long-term for infrastructure investment, was diminished in part because of the city fiscal crisis and in part because we were spending money on a lot of other things that were socially very useful, but we didn't increase the revenue base enough. Now that this city is thriving and our population is growing and our tax base is growing, we've got to really go, in my judgment at least, start to go back to square one and think, where do we want to make our investments and how do we generate more revenues so that we can borrow more money?
Well, it seems to me that the Bloomberg administration is attempting to, economic growth is sort of the policy. And if they can attract more people, they're assuming that that revenue base will expand.
Well, I think they are indeed, but I think one needs new sources of revenue to support indebtedness for capital purposes. There are constitutional limitations to the amount of money the city can borrow for capital purposes.
And we're hitting those
that are tied to, yes, that's why the city created a special instrumentality to do additional borrowing a couple of years ago.
Are you concerned about the level of debt that the city, or when you add in all of those public authorities, are you concerned that we already are too indebted as it is?
No, I'm not.
You're one of the only ones who doesn't seem to be.
Look, nobody likes, as a taxpayer and an owner of property, nobody enjoys paying more taxes. On the other hand, I remember when I was chairman of the MTA and I realized that the subway system would be dysfunctional if we didn't have a massive investment in it. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get the legislature and the Congress to enact laws that expanded our borrowing authority very substantially, and I borrowed $8 billion and rebuilt the subway system. Now today, nobody complains about it. Everybody's very grateful and says the growth would not have taken place if we didn't have an improved and functional subway system. So I mean, I understand the reluctance to incur debt. But the question is, what's the source of revenue that's going to repay that debt?
If you were in a position where you could influence this, would you then increase the borrowing levels? Would you increase tax burdens on private businesses and residents?
Well,
I
would look at taxes such as a tax on gasoline as a source of revenue that can be hypothecated for transportation projects.
So
absolutely.
What about the commuter tax? That's been discussed.
Well, clearly it was a mistake to repeal the commuter tax. It's politically very tough to bring it back, but yes, absolutely, there's no question that the people who enjoy the benefits of New York City but don't live here should be sharing in the burden of paying for the services that they're getting the benefit of.
We're hearing from the demographic world that we could see a population increase of another 1.5 million residents. And I think for many people, they're like, well, where are they going to go? And how are they going to find housing? Are we sort of in a crisis point, or we still have the luxury of time?
We have a serious housing shortage, particularly for people who are not extremely well-to-do. But people's housing habits have changed, and living patterns have changed. A lot of younger people are partnering up and living together. A lot of older people are moving into the city because they can afford to, selling their suburban homes and moving back here. So I wouldn't say it's a crisis, but I would say it's a growing problem. And I think the city government is addressing it in a very sensible way, given, again, the limitation of resources. We have a first-rate housing commissioner who's come up with some very, very creative ideas, and hopefully they will be supported by all the other people in the political process, and we'll begin to produce some more middle-income housing.
There was an interesting article in the New York Times not too long ago about a town in Westchester that can't afford to, it doesn't have enough volunteer firefighters and teachers and policemen because they can't afford to live in the area. I don't know if you happen to see that. I worry that the city is becoming so expensive, and you hear over and over again this concern that the middle class is being priced out of the city. Who will do the work of that we need to have done in the city to keep it going?
Well, there's no question it's a serious problem, and that's why you're going to see a lot of people of more modest income living further and further from the central core of the city, and that's why there has to be far more focus on providing access to the urban center here. I would say the single most important transportation project is the ARC project, the new train tunnel from New Jersey across the Hudson River. I would say another main line on the Long Island Railroad, some kind of mass transit going east to west in Westchester, additional rail lines up to the counties north of Westchester, the 2nd Avenue subway. All of those are
And do you see those
important
priorities being reflected in the choices that are being made now?
Not adequately, in my judgment, although the governor of New Jersey recognizes the importance of the ARC project, and New Jersey Transit people do, and I think organizations like Regional Plan, who have been speaking out on behalf of this, but it's hard to get a constituency to support something that's going to take years to happen, because the gestation period of any public infrastructure project is so long. It normally takes a lot longer to get one of those projects underway than the term of any elected official, particularly now that we have term limits, so that it's less appealing to the people whose profession is to run for office.
Well, we did it once before. Hopefully we can do it again. We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Richard Ravitch, a partner at Ravitch Rice and Co. and a longtime civic leader of New York City. Let's talk a little bit about land use and zoning policies. How would you characterize what the Bloomberg administration has been doing so far?
Well, I think the Planning Commission under Amanda Burden's leadership has done some very creative things with some specific new zoning proposals for finite parts of the city. I think that's very creative. I think that the housing problem, which we talked about earlier, could be abated if we adopted a somewhat more flexible program that would permit increased density in exchange for the production of some affordable housing. Because we have, the city just doesn't have the budget capacity to provide a lot of subsidized housing itself, and most of the population, the overwhelming population, percentage of the population can't afford housing if every element of the cost of housing is at the market rate. It's really beyond, as I said, the capacity of the majority of New Yorkers. So one way of reducing the cost is to be able to build more
taller
footage. That runs into a lot of community opposition and concerns people have.
So you would trade higher buildings for more public housing,
yes,
being set aside in those taller buildings?
Well, not necessarily public housing,
Subsidized.
technically mean, but middle-income housing, yes. I think that the land use policy of the city is expressed through a zoning ordinance, and I think that that ought to be examined on a broader scale. I don't think anybody really contemplated that this population explosion would occur, particularly after 9/11. But there are a number of factors that I think have caused this. One, the city government itself is extremely well managed. Number two, New York is a magnet for people from all over the world. I taught somebody's course at Baruch College the other day, and 31 out of 32 students in the room were foreign born. It's a remarkable thing, and you go to, I imagine if I stood here in the lobby at the Graduate Center, I would see people from all over the world. And they're coming here, and young people are coming here. And the nature of people's lives has changed and makes an urban setting 100 times more attractive. There are people in, whether it's in the .com business or in the arts business, and the number of people who are employed by nonprofit organizations has grown exponentially. So it's not just the traditional source of growth, which was Wall Street and the ancillary services associated with Wall Street. This is still the entertainment capital of the world, and which, by the way, is one of the United States' biggest exports is entertainment today.
So this has come as a bit of a surprise that since 9/11 it's rebounded as well as it has.
It's just rebounded marvelously, and it's the growth is hard to measure, actually, because so much of it consists of people who don't necessarily show up in the census surveys. We have a lot of illegal immigrants. Mm-hmm. No, I'm very bullish about New York. I think it's going to continue to be an extremely exciting place for people to come to.
Now, you were not a supporter of the bid to have the Olympics here and to build up the West Side.
Oh, no, I was supportive of the idea of having the Olympics. Actually, I chaired the effort in 1977 to get the '84 Summer Olympics to New York. So I'm a great fan of the Olympics. I just thought that had we been successful, the location of choice for the major stadium should have been Queens.
I should have rephrased it then. It was really the building up of the West Side that was...
Well, I think putting a stadium there was wrong, having expectations that the MTA would convey that property, which is owned by the MTA and worth a great deal of money, to such a project for a nominal consideration was outrageous public policy.
Well, you must be happy that it didn't go through.
I am indeed.
And now do you feel like we're reorienting our priorities in ways that...
Well, at least we're not building a major stadium in Midtown. But I think our number one issue, finite issue that has to be addressed is downtown. I think that's still unresolved. It's much more difficult to resolve now than it would have been a few years ago, when it would have been possible for the public to acquire the leasehold through a condemnation proceeding. I think it's very tough now because the insurance proceeds are now in the hands of the developer, and nobody can be sure what the legal outcome would be. I think building the Freedom Tower makes no sense whatsoever. Nobody wants to move into it. It's an attractive nuisance in the most literal sense of the word. On the other hand, I certainly respect the governor's sense of the symbolism of building something and telling the world of terrorists, you're not going to keep us down. We're going to show you. But I think there are other ways of memorializing our commitment to rebuild this, and I think we need a lot more housing. City had a terrific plan to begin with, but that sort of gave way when the governor agreed to support the stadium on the West Side.
Well, now there's
But now the mayor is more active in downtown, and that's all for the good, because after all, downtown is part of the city of New York and part of his responsibility.
What about outer borough development? Are there certain areas that you think should be targeted?
Well, I think that there are areas where the city's done, the Planning Commission's done some very creative things with the Brooklyn waterfront. I think you're going to see tremendous expansion in Williamsburg. I think you're going to see it ultimately in the East Bronx. That's where the investment of public dollars in transportation infrastructure and schools is critically important.
How about the most basic things like electricity and water? Are we going to be all right on that front, or are there things we should be?
I think, I have no particular expertise at that, but yes, I think other than the fact that we're too dependent on oil, and therefore very vulnerable to the kind of inflation in the cost of energy that we're going through right now. I think sooner or later, probably a little bit later than I would like to see, we're going to go back and re-examine nuclear energy
as a city,
as a source. Well, as a country,
as a country, right?
As a country.
But we had the,
there
the
are very
blackout.
few ways that we can reduce our dependency on a handful of people who control the supply of oil. And I think that water, the city at great expense has built a new water tunnel, and their city is now, the last decade or so, been charging for water, whereas it had been free before, and that makes sense. I can't predict what nature's going to do, but I don't think anybody is aware of that as a serious growth problem. I think healthcare is an important issue because, not so much because of geography and land use, but because the Medicaid costs chew up so much of the budget that it becomes very, very burdensome to the taxpayers. And since healthcare is everybody's first priority, it's hard to modify that. I think if we were starting all over today in the world that we live in with the knowledge we have and the nature of healthcare, we'd construct a totally different kind of primary healthcare system. To have these very high-cost hospitals be the locus for performing so much primary care is a very economically inefficient way of doing it.
Well, aren't we now sort of taking a look at the way the hospital network is made up? It seems like we're going to be closing.
Hopefully. I mean, there is a commission, and it's chaired by a very able guy, and they will make some recommendations, but they don't have the power to do anything. And one person's waste elimination is another human being's job, so it always gets politically tougher.
Well, you've mentioned that, you know, we've, as a city, historically, we had a political will to invest in things that took a long time to rebound in our benefit. Do you feel like the political will is just not there anymore to take those kinds of...
Well, term limits hasn't helped, number one. As I said before, the gestation period of an infrastructure project is longer than the average term of any elected official, so doesn't have a lot of political appeal.
And now we're in the second term of a business-oriented mayor. I would guess that you would want those kinds of policies to be continued. Do you worry at all about the next generation of political leaders and whether they'll continue some of these policies?
You know, this is not a time, and I'm not commenting on any individual, I would hope that there will emerge another able person like Mike Bloomberg to become the next mayor. They may have a different set of priorities, and hopefully will focus a little more on the question of long-term growth and public infrastructure. But we're not living in an era in which we're attracting the best talent into politics, and that's a worrisome factor, whether it starts in Washington or where it ends up. But there are some young, bright people in politics in New York who I think the world of, without expressing any partisan preferences, in bright young people in both parties who I think will have a good chance of doing good things.
But don't you think culturally they're also, as you say, we live in a different era where we just don't really have the appetite that we once had?
Yes, there's no question that we live in an era in which instant gratification seems to be more compelling than long-term satisfaction. That's a function very much of our culture and what appears on television sets most of the time. Well, and
we'll try to make it
changing.
We'll try to make a difference.
Right.
I've been fortunate to have a longtime New York City civic leader, Richard Ravitch, as my guest. Thank you, Dick, for being on the show.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, With students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Over the next decade, New York City faces an extraordinary challenge. The good news is that people still want to live here and are coming in droves. The bad news? Unless we alter our behavior and commit substantial new resources, the people we depend on to provide critical services, firefighters, policemen, school teachers, sanitation workers, won't be able to afford to live and work here. New York is in the midst of a real estate explosion, yet the housing that's being built is unaffordable to most newcomers. Hospitals are being cut, not expanded. Capital investment in new schools, subway lines, bridges, and tunnels is occurring at far too slow a pace. Even our water and electricity supplies will soon be overstretched. Fortunately, the Bloomberg administration is hard at work on these issues, but it's going to require public investment, lots of it, and that will be hard to come up with given our already high tax burden and the city's budgetary problems. New York is on the verge of another major boom. It could be exciting, or it could get ugly. It all depends on us. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.